Hey everyone, welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, so just hang tight and we'll get started soon. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we let the room fill, so feel free to hang out. We'll get started shortly in about a minute or two. Welcome everyone to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in about one more minute, so just hang tight. We're just waiting for the room to fill a little. Cool. I think everyone is in. So I just want to say thank you everyone for joining the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. Hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. So in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our members through some of our campaign work, volunteer opportunities, and events and online webinars such as these. And so now I get to engage with you all here. So just feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A function as we go, but we won't answer any of those questions until the end. A little bit about what we'll cover today. We'll talk about why Tech Equity exists as an organization and how we got started. I'll talk about the key issues we've identified as an organization to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And I'll talk about how we can take action together to address our most pressing economic issues. But before we get into all that, let's talk about why we're here. So, Tech Equity really got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of the problem. So, they noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, increases in traffic, increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions to some of the issues they were seeing around them. And especially now, in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. But at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So, as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate inequality within our region and within our state. Um, so, because of this affordability crisis, it's understandable as to why communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in the communities and what that means for them. But also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success, both for themselves and for their family members alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help, and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. While we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, like we just talked about, that's even further exacerbating some of the issues we see around us, it's important to note that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. So, more than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So, This is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. I think the fact that rents are rising isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know, we feel this, we've heard this from friends and family all around us. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization and it's where tech is headquartered. But a version of this story is playing out all throughout the country in different tech hubs in different cities throughout the US. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. Before the pandemic hit, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So, in the span of about a month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. So at TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. And we have to show up and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At Tech Equity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this. And the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today to find out how to get more involved and just find out about what's going on in our state. So our goal at Tech Equity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have historically institutionalized inequity, leading us to stronger and more resilient communities. So we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live through events we hold, such as book clubs, panel discussions with experts, webinars such as these, and voter guides that we produce around election season. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. So, a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked in coalition with community leaders, legislators, and organizations to get a law passed that now extends renters protections to over 8 million Californians, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, which is aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements with companies. Tech workers, as we mentioned, have an outsized political power that's largely untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practice in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At Tech Equity Collaborative, our two issue areas that we focus on are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of our work, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, and we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. While the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, like we just talked about, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our own neighborhoods. This affordability crisis, as we mentioned, is decades in the making, and the policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for the level of pain our community is feeling now, and especially during the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, and especially within communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So, redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image on the screen, it's all those red neighborhoods. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment. So these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So, in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically and underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So the crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. In fact, as we talked about, it extends all throughout California and all throughout the country. And there are many examples of redline communities, such as Austin and Atlanta, which you can see on the screen, examples of two tech hubs right now that have historically been redlined. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who have lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be anything like a huge rent increase, a sudden loss of a job, your car breaks down and it's super expensive. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening. Many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions often predate tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. So the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Many people in our community were already struggling. And with unemployment on a steep rise and city and state budgets that are being depleted by emergency response efforts, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. As we can see in this chart, the hourly pay for workers has not increased throughout the last couple of decades, even though the amount of productivity has dramatically increased. So, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So the cost of living here was already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to be able to afford living in your average 2 bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making about $133,000 a year, you can afford an average 2 bedroom working a regular 8 hour day, 8 hour shift, right? However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours to afford that two-bedroom apartment. Once again, that's 40 hours a day to be able to afford that two-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're creating an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the cities where they work in. And this problem persists across the country, like we talked about. And even though costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, Atlanta aren't as high, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. So some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to be able to afford that apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us how much we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, which stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job in meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. So that's that huge bracket on the right side of the chart. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough for lower and moderate income people. And that's the brackets all the way on the left side. So you can see they're comparably way smaller than the above moderate income bracket. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from our area altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important to ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while folks with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So for every high income person coming into the Bay Area, a low income person is being pushed out at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So displacement really is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. And the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by the current pandemic. And as you can see, this chart's from 2016, so we don't know yet the full extent of the impact of the pandemic has and will have on displacement in the Bay Area. And we can't just build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. So tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today really is the result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities a better place to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without policy change. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability, like we just talked about. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing, by removing lengthy administrative processes that are making it too expensive to build homes. Preservation. We need to make sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing that we already have. Protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the amount of housing that we need, but in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from being displaced. And finally, racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems, and it's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. That means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing so that we can craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors, as we talked about, are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. So we want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role you're in. So we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse employees, contracted workers. So, in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we've created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, and making sure that their workplace is safe and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. So, training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality, and it will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve the crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just the broader, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. So we need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. So we must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So you may be wondering again, like, how can you get involved? Well, we host tons of educational events. We have one coming up about revealing the disparities in contracting work in the tech sector, which I'll be talking about in a bit. If you're interested in public policy, you can check out our priority legislation page, which I'll link in a follow-up email after this. So we're organizing our membership around certain bills that are currently in the legislature, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then for corporate practice, so we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved in these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So, like I said, you can reply to a follow-up email if that's of interest to you, and we'll put you in connection with our corporate partnership managers. So this is how we work. We try to make it as easy and as accessible as possible to plug in, but also build community in the process. And this year, we're excited to continue our work in the housing and our labor spaces through creating ethical work practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that further drives inequality and upholds systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So, what can you do today? You can do three things right after you get off this call. So, you could tell a friend about our work and just get the word out there that we exist and that we're here as a resource and also a way for folks to engage within the tech sector. You can support us financially by becoming a member. So, we offer memberships for $10 a month or $100 a year. But it's not the only way you can engage with us. And finally, you can take action by supporting some of the priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So first, we have the rental registry. So TechEquity is committed to getting better data about the housing market, and better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure that help is being targeted to people who need it most. TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that that data is being used fairly through our rent registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we ran a bill, AB 1188, that unfortunately stalled out in the legislative process this year. So we plan to continue to pursue establishing a rental registry and make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter, join our Slack so that you can keep up to date as to the progress with our work on a rental registry. You can also check out other various pieces of legislation that relate to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So we've decided to focus our advocacy on these bills that you can see on the screen because they will do the most to ensure an affordable home, family sustaining job, and a true safety net are available to all Californians. So if you'd like more information on these bills, I'll include links on the follow-up email, as I said, and you can sign on as community endorsers for any of these if you'd like. For upcoming events, we have one event coming up, which you can register for free online on June 24th, 12 to 1 p.m. So the event is called Tech Shadow Workforce, Revealing Disparities in Contract Work. So we'll be exploring the working conditions of contracted workers across the tech industry, talking about how inequities are baked into the contracting structure and what public and corporate policies can be built to protecting this growing set of workers. So as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can become a member for $10 a month or $100 a year, or you can take action with us on one of the priority legislations we just talked about. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So if you have any questions, now would be the time for questions. I recorded this presentation, so you'll have access to the recording afterwards, which you can share. I'll also be sharing a link to the slide deck. And yeah, so I'll just take a minute to see if anyone has any questions, but you can also respond to the follow-up email if a question comes up later. Cool. So I'm not seeing any questions, which is perfectly fine. No worries. So just want to thank you so much for taking time today to learn more about our organization and learn more about how to get plugged in. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement, either as a member, a supporter, a volunteer, and hope to see you at some of our future events. So just want to thank everyone and hope to see you soon. Just keep an eye out on that follow-up email. Thank you.